Welcome to Rights and Remedies, the podcast where we explore the law, the fight for justice, and healing. I'm Allison Mahoney, your host and a lawyer dedicated to fighting for the rights of survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, as well as children harmed by the child welfare system. Each week, we delve into legal battles and court cases, share powerful stories that demand change, and spotlight the cutting-edge practices that are helping victims on their journey to healing. So, if you're ready to dive into the intersection of advocacy and healing, subscribe to Rights and Remedies today. New episodes are released weekly, and we can't wait to have you join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference. In this podcast, we're going to talk quite a bit about the foster care system in the United States and issues that are plaguing the foster care system in the United States. Therefore, I thought it might be helpful to have an episode that gives a high-level overview of how the foster care system in the U.S. functions, and which will hopefully help listeners to also understand who some of the key players are in the foster care system. Today, we have just under 400,000 children in foster care in the United States. That number has been steadily declining over the past several years, which is a good thing, but that's still a lot of kids who are in foster care. Every year, anywhere from approximately 250,000 to 200,000 children are entering and exiting foster care in the United States. The foster care system is made up of a combination of federal, state, and local organizations. At the federal level, the federal government supports state foster care through legislation, funding, and then there's oversight that's tied to that funding. The agency to know is the Children's Bureau, which is a federal agency within the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. And the Children's Bureau is really charged with implementing federal child and family legislation. The primary responsibility, however, for child welfare services is usually with the state or county, depending on how the state's foster care system is set up. I say that because not every foster care system in the United States is the same. So most states have a centralized administration system, which means that they're what we refer to as state-administered foster care systems. There are 9 states, however, that have county-administered foster care systems, which means most of the child welfare responsibilities are given to the counties to then administer within that county. Examples of county-administered systems are New York, Colorado, California, and so it varies. There's some places that have a bit of a hybrid. Children can enter foster care in a number of different ways, and this is also important to understand. The most, I think, well-known way that kids enter foster care is if they're abused or neglected, and that can look like a bunch of different things. It can look like they may have experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, severe emotional abuse, perhaps they were medically neglected. All of these sorts of things can result in a child being placed in foster care. They also may have been abandoned, and in some places, children can voluntarily be placed in foster care. I used to represent children in New York City in foster care cases, and this is something that happens there, and I always found those cases to be especially heartbreaking because a parent or guardian was bringing their child to court and voluntarily handing their child over to the foster care system. So children in foster care represent a really vulnerable population. They've already experienced trauma at home. That's what ultimately led to them becoming involved with the child welfare system. And then being placed in foster care is another trauma that they're experiencing because they're being separated from their families, from their communities, possibly having to change schools. It's really disruptive and scary. Many kids in foster care have disabilities. And then there's also a disproportionate number of children of color in foster care. When a child is placed in foster care, there is court involvement. So there's a court case that is open, and that court case is basically looking to or determining whether abuse or neglect occurred. And then ultimately the goal is to help the child achieve what's called permanency, which I'll explain later. And so while this case is pending, and the case is pending the entire time that they're in foster care. So if a child is in foster care from the time that they're 3 years old until 18 years old, there is a court case pending that entire time. In terms of representation, sometimes a child or young person in foster care has an attorney or an advocate. Sometimes they don't. So, and this varies from one jurisdiction to another. In some states, children don't get anything. They have no advocate. In others, they don't have an attorney, but they may have a volunteer like a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, who meets with the child and then submits a report to the court, basically laying out what's happening with the child and providing an opinion as to what things would be in the child's best interest. Beyond that, in some places, a child is assigned an attorney, and attorneys can function in 2 different ways in foster care systems. Are you or someone you love a victim of sexual assault, cybersexual abuse, domestic violence, or campus dating violence? At ALM Law, we're here to help you regain control and take action. With expertise in Colorado, Illinois, and New York, our compassionate attorneys understand the challenges you're facing. That's why we're offering a free 15-minute consultation to answer your questions and help you understand your options. Just mention this podcast, Rights and Remedies. Take the first step towards justice today. Call ALM Law at 970-315-5152 or visit us at almlawllc.com. You're not alone. Let us stand with you. On the one hand, they might be something like a GIL or a guardian ad litem who advocates for whatever is in the child's best interest. And so I've heard of this being referred to as substituting judgment for a child. The attorney is telling the court what they believe in their professional opinion is in a child's best interest. That's even if what they're saying does not line up or contradicts what the child wants. So a kid may say, I want to go home, but the guardian ad litem might say, that's not in the child's best interest to go home, and so they will go to court and advocate for something different. On the other hand, some places have attorneys who do direct advocacy, which means the attorney has a traditional attorney-client relationship with the child, and they advocate for whatever the child wants. Now, there are differing viewpoints on which is better when it comes to attorney representation, which probably could be an episode in and of itself. I can tell you that when I was doing this and in New York, we did direct advocacy, and I am a firm believer that that is a good thing. However, other people have different viewpoints. Some places also have kind of a hybrid where they'll have a GIL and someone advocating for a child's best interest up until a certain age, and then it switches when a child is maybe a teen to direct advocacy. So the representation piece can get a little complicated. Children are supposed to be in foster care for the shortest time necessary, and the initial goal is always to reunify them with their family. During a foster care case or an abuse and neglect proceeding, there's always a permanency goal for a child. And the permanency goal is, what is the outcome? What's going to happen for this case to be closed? And so that could be reunification with a child's family. It could be termination of parental rights and adoption by someone else. It could be that a relative or close family friend gets custody of the child or guardianship over them. Or there's something called APLA, which is another planned permanent living arrangement. That's a last resort and reserved only for young people 16 years of age and older. And APLA essentially means that they are aging out without one of those other permanency plans. And so they're supposed to have an adult connection and independent living services in place to help them learn how to basically live on their own once they get out of foster care, once they're 18. In foster care, there's also a whole bunch of different placement types. And we look at this on a spectrum. A child's placement is supposed to be in the least restrictive, most family-like setting available to them. And There should be an emphasis on placement stability, meaning not bouncing a kid from one placement to another, because that can be really, really harmful to a child. And then there's supposed to be placement matching, meaning the agency that's overseeing the foster care system and the caseworker assigned to the case is supposed to be looking at a child's unique needs and then matching them to an appropriate level of placement and placement type. And then the other emphasis is that if children are entering foster care with siblings, the siblings are supposed to be kept together and not separated. Of course, that's not always possible, but that is the goal. So in terms of placement types, like I said, we look for the least restrictive, most family-like settings. And there's basically a continuum of placements that are very family-like and then placements that are not family-like at all. So in terms of least family or most family-like, excuse me, we have kinship care, which means placing a child with a relative or close family friend, like a godparent. Up from there, in terms of family-like settings, is placement in a foster home, which means being placed with a stranger who is a licensed foster parent. And then up from there, we have what's called congregate care placements, which are group care. And within congregate care, there are a bunch of different types of placements. There are emergency shelters, which are supposed to be very short term, but sometimes they're not short term placements. There are group homes, which have fewer kids in them. And then there are residential facilities and psychiatric residential treatment facilities, which are the most restrictive, least family-like settings out there. While kids are in foster care, the agency overseeing foster care, the foster care system, is not only thinking about placement and where a child is placed, but also services for that child and for their family. And services are anything from mental health services, educational supports, maybe transportation services. If a child is placed in a home that's further away from where their school is, but they want to keep going to the same school, and that's possible, there could be transportation services set up to help get them to school. Services might include supervised family visitation, and then there's specialized services available to children who have experienced certain types of abuse, like trafficking or sexual abuse, along with a whole host of other services out there. But it's really important that states and counties have robust services for children and families, because if they're not getting the help they need, and especially with kids to overcome the trauma that they're experiencing, then the system is at risk of doing more harm than good. Every child who is in foster care is assigned a caseworker, and the caseworker is supposed to be following that case. They're supposed to be visiting the child every single month in private, so not in front of other kids, not in front of a foster parent, not in front of residential staff if the child is in a residential facility. It's supposed to be in private so that the child can have an open and honest conversation with the caseworker. So, for example, if a child is being abused in a foster home, they're not going to be able to disclose that abuse if the meeting with the caseworker is happening right in front of the abusive foster parent. Also, these monthly visits, the majority of the visits are supposed to take place in a child's placement. So sometimes caseworkers will meet with a kid outside of their placement. So I've seen situations where caseworkers have met with a child just before a court appearance at court in the hallway. Sometimes they'll meet with them at school, which usually is not an ideal situation, because you think about how kids feel when they're around other children. They don't want to be labeled as different. I've even been told that kids don't want to be referred to as foster children. They don't like that label. They don't want to be different. And so having a caseworker come and pull them out of class and meet with them separately really can amplify that stigma that might be associated with being in foster care. Caseworkers do not have easy jobs. They are in high stress situations, sometimes in dangerous situations if they're having to go out into the field, into homes that aren't safe or placements that aren't safe. Many times they have high caseloads, which adds to the stress and affects, of course, the attention that can be placed on a case. And without enough attention on a case, there's a risk that services might fall through, that a child's not in the right placement, a bunch of things could go wrong. And so there's also high turnover within caseworker positions across the country. So high caseloads, high turnover, and sometimes there's a lack of support for caseworkers who are working in this really difficult job. The problem with high turnover is that a child doesn't have consistency then, and they're not working with the same person. And so that trust can't be maintained if they're having a new person come in and out of their life constantly. Other things to know is markers of good systems are systems that collect data and then analyze that data. So collecting the data is not enough. We need to also be analyzing it. So for instance, foster care systems should be tracking the number of placements that a child is in, and it should be flagged if they've been in 19 or 20 different placements. They should be tracking investigations into maltreatment in care, so abuses within foster homes or residential facilities, along with a whole bunch of other things. Caseworker caseloads is another good one for systems to track. And there's actually standards that are set by organizations, including one called the Child Welfare League of America. They set standards for how you count a case, if it's by family or by child, and the number of cases that a caseworker should have. And then, of course, it's really important for foster care systems to have transparency with the community and families that it's working with. There's a lot more to know about how our foster care systems function, but as I said, my hope was to give a very high-level overview so that there's a bit more understanding when we get into other episodes and really try and discuss some of the nuanced pieces of how our foster care systems are functioning, and especially when we look into where there's problematic areas and room for improvement. Thank you for joining us on Rights and Remedies. I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights into the legal issues facing victims and the pathways to healing. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Whether you're a survivor, an advocate, or someone looking to learn more, we're here to support and empower you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. You can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at ALM Law LLC for updates, resources, and more. Until next time, take care and remember that together we can make a difference.